I think that depends on how the US-China relationship evolves, how intense the strategic rivalry becomes, and also on how strongly committed Australia is to supporting the United States. Now, I think on the first issue, I do think there are signs of concern. I think, for example, under the Biden administration, I think we saw escalating rivalry between the US and China, a more intense strategic contest between them, growing concerns about, for example, clashes over Taiwan. Um, how difficult a problem that is for Australia to manage in future will depend a lot on how that develops. My own view is that under the Trump administration, despite some aggressive language from, for example, Secretary of State Pete Hegseth at the Shangri-La Dialogue earlier this year, I think the Trump administration is less committed to sustaining America's position in East Asia, more willing to contemplate an accommodation with China, and therefore I think in the longer term we may see a lessening of that kind of rivalry, which I think will make it easier for Australia to manage its positioning between the US and China. Likewise, I do think that partly because of the conduct of the Trump administration, its fairly unsympathetic attitude towards allies, its doubts, for example, about important features of the US-Australia strategic relationship like AUKUS. I think the tendency in Australia, the willingness of Australia to back the United States against China will decline somewhat as the policy making out of Washington becomes more erratic. And we've seen evidence of this recently. For example, in Mr. Albanese's given a speech last weekend in which he spoke a lot about Australia's independence. And I think he was referring there in a guarded way to his desire for Australia to chart a different path from America in its dealings with the region, including with China. So I think on both of those aspects, the US-China aspect and the Australia-US aspect, I think the capacity for Australia to manage the tensions, the inherent tensions in the significance of its relationship with China as an economic partner and with America as a strategic partner, I think that's going to become, if anything, a little bit easier in the years ahead. I think when we look at the long historical pattern in the last 10 years or even longer, I do think it's very clear that the distribution of wealth and power has shifted very strongly China's way. China's economic growth, of course, its development as a technological power, its developments as a military power, including, of course, its very significant expansion of air and maritime capabilities, the strengthening of its diplomatic position in Southeast Asia, for example, I think the overall sort of approach that China has taken has put it in a much stronger position than the United States. I think the United States, for example, in its protectionist policies, has tended to alienate many Southeast Asian countries, and I think its relative neglect of the region, its failure to really respond effectively to China's growing military strength, means that China is now in a better position than it was a decade ago to contest America's position as a leading power in the region. And I think that's, in the long term, it's a significant factor in Australia's evolving attitude towards its future place in Asia. I think China's capacity to prevail in a US-China war over Taiwan has grown very significantly as its air and maritime forces in particular have developed a lot in recent years. I think America has responded very sluggishly to that challenge. I think America has failed to take the steps that will be necessary to preserve the advantage that it used to enjoy over the PLA in the kind of capabilities and operations that will be involved in a Taiwanese contingency. I therefore think that there's a declining capacity of the United States effectively to deter China from taking military action over Taiwan, or for that matter, in the event of a crisis in the South China Sea, for example. I do think that is a sort of fundamental principle of power politics, the less likely you are to win a conflict, the harder it is to convince your potential adversary that you're willing to fight it, and therefore the less effective your deterrent posture is going to be. I think we also need to add to that the nuclear dimension. I think for a long time, US policymakers and strategists tended to overlook the significance of China's nuclear capabilities as a factor in US decision-making about whether or not to go to Taiwan's defense. And I think there's a significant increase in understanding now in the United States that a Taiwan contingency could escalate to a nuclear war, and that in a nuclear war, the costs and risks to America would be much, much higher than they would be in a conventional war. The potential, of course, for attacks on the US homeland. And I think both the development of China's own nuclear capabilities in recent years and the prospects for further developments in the years ahead, and the lessons of the Ukraine crisis, which I think have been very significant in reaffirming the significance of nuclear weapons in contemporary power politics. I think both of those factors have meant that, quite apart from the shifting conventional balance I mentioned, I think the nuclear balance is also a very significant part of that. I therefore think that the US deterrent posture in relation to China over issues like Taiwan has weakened significantly and will continue to do so in the years ahead. I think the reality is that if you look at the raw calculus of power, we are already living in a multipolar world, and indeed in a multipolar region. Globally, the idea that the United States would be the unchallengeably dominant power across the globe, which appeared in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, that idea is past. We now live in a world in which there are a number of major centers of power. America, of course, is still one of them. China is one. India, I think, is one. Russia is one. And I think Europe, too, is increasingly becoming a major pole in its own right. And so I think we're living in a multipolar world, and I think we need to accept that and learn to live with it. I think we're also living in a multipolar Asia. I think in East Asia and the Western Pacific, China is already the strongest power by far, but there are other important powers in East Asia and the Western Pacific, including, of course, Japan. And of course, in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region, we have India as a major player, a great power, I think, in its own right. So I think we'll see in future an Asia, we're already seeing, I think, an Asia which is essentially divided between what we might call primarily a Chinese and an Indian sphere of influence, but with other significant powers, as I say, Japan, but I think also Indonesia in future as its economy grows, which it very likely will. So the question is, I think that's the reality. The question is, can that multipolar order, both at the global and at the regional level, be managed peacefully? I think it can be. So I'm an optimist in that respect. I think there's a real prospect that as a region, we can find a way to recognize the strong position of the great powers, but also find a way for smaller and middle powers like Australia to have their own place in the region, to have their own say, to be able to protect their interests, to be able to work constructively with one another and with the great powers. There are plenty of examples of history of these kind of multipolar orders working like that. The challenge, I think, for us in Asia is to focus on the task of ensuring that the multipolar strategic order that we're living in can be managed peacefully and in a way that ensures the prosperity of countries across the region. I do think the era of US primacy in Asia is over. I think that's past. I think the question we face now is whether or not the US will continue to play some lesser but still significant role in Asia, or whether it will play no role at all. Now, I think many countries in the region, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, I think certainly, would prefer to see the United States remain in Asia as in a kind of a balancing role, so that it contributes as one of the poles in that multipolar regional order. And for example, that's what our foreign minister, Penny Wong, refers to when she talks about a region in which no country dominates and no country is dominated. And she talks about the United States contributing to a balance of power in Asia. Now, I think that would be a desirable outcome. I think Asia, it would be easier to build the kind of stable multipolar order in Asia, which worked for countries throughout the region if the United States continued to contribute. But I don't think we should take it for granted that it will. I think the fact is that the costs to America of preserving a significant, substantial strategic presence in East Asia in the face of China's power, in the face, for that matter, of India's power, is going to be very high. And I think the imperatives for America to do that are not going to be that high. I think when I speak to Americans, I get the sense that if they can't dominate in the region as they used to do, they're more likely to simply withdraw and leave it to Asia to work out how to manage our strategic affairs. And again, we can see a parallel here with what's happening in Europe, where I think America is in effect saying to the Europeans, that the Europeans themselves should manage the strategic order in their part of the world without the United States playing a significant role. I think it's likely that US approach to Asia will evolve in the same way. In my book about how to defend Australia, my 2019 book, How to Defend Australia, what I sought to do was to ask, if Australia finds itself living in an Asia in which the United States is no longer playing a significant role, which I think is the most likely future we face, then how should we think about defending ourselves? Because throughout our history, we've depended on our great and powerful friends, first Britain, then America, to really guarantee our security. And so the question for Australia is it faces a future in which those outside powers no longer play a significant role in Asia and therefore can't play a significant role in defending us. We have to ask ourselves, how do we defend ourselves? Now, many people in Australia have argued that Australia can't defend itself, that our population is too small, our continent is too big, the challenges are too vast. I think that's wrong, and what I sought to do in that book was to set out how Australia should think about its security, what kind of defence approach it should take, and what kind of forces it might have to build to do that. And I think the arguments I made then are still correct. I think the book is basically still a good blueprint for Australia's defence in this coming era. The point I made in my Sleepwalk to War quarterly essay was that, particularly under the Biden administration, as the Biden administration, you remember Joe Biden 4 times said that America would go to war to defend Taiwan if it was attacked. Now, that seemed to me to be a very dangerous proposition to make, because I don't believe the United States could win a war with China over Taiwan, and I don't believe that it would be at all sensible for America to go to war with China for that reason. Now, I think there's a very significant issue for Australia there, because the closeness of our alliance with the United States and the way in which our political leaders were at that stage, identifying Australia very, very closely with US policy, particularly through initiatives like the AUKUS submarine program, did raise a very clear assumption, expectation, that if the US found itself going to war with China over an issue like Taiwan, then Australia would join. Now, I think that's a question which is now less clear. I think Australian doubts about supporting the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, have grown significantly. And so I think that is a less significant risk now than it used to be. Nonetheless, I do think Australia still faces a very big challenge to rethink our approach to our role in Asia, our relations in the region, and indeed our relations with China, in the face of this shift that we're talking about from a region in which the United States has played a very strong or even dominant role on the one hand, to a region in which my expectation is the United States will not play a very significant role in the decades to come. And I think that transition is one that we're still very much trying to work our way through. I think the shift from the Trump administration, from the Biden administration, and the fact that Trump has been re-elected for a second term is a very significant development. I think it shows that some of the policies and ideas that underlie the MAGA movement, the Trump movement, are not just anomalies in US politics. I think they reflect some very deep and fundamental shifts in the way America thinks of itself and thinks of its role in the world. And I think that's very significant for the US, of course, but it's also very significant for US allies. And I do think that at the heart of Trump's policy approach is a return to isolationism. I do think fundamentally that Trump does not think that the United States should commit itself to defending allies in remote parts of the world, like in East Asia or in Europe. And I think that runs very deep in Trump's whole approach. And so I think that is compelling Australians to think more carefully about the extent to which we should presuppose that the United States will be there to support us, and that Australia's approach to dealing with the fundamental strategic shifts underway in Asia at the moment should be simply to support US policy, whatever happens. So I think there's a really, the election of the second Trump administration, the way the second Trump administration has conducted itself since its inauguration back in January, is a fundamental new element in our thinking. On the other hand, I also think that the deeper trends which are driving the future of America's role in Asia, the future of the evolution of strategic affairs in Asia, and therefore Australia's approach to the region, I think those are even bigger than Trump. So I think even if Trump hadn't been elected, even if we'd had another Democrat administration under Kamala Harris, for example, I think the long-term shift for America to move away from playing the kind of dominant role that it used to play in Asia towards withdrawal from the region, I think those long-term trends are already deeply established. For example, Joe Biden, as we mentioned before, talked a lot about America's determination to help defend Taiwan if it was attacked, but he did nothing substantial to increase America's military capacity in the region to prevail in such a war. And I therefore think that, following the principle that you should pay attention to what people do rather than to what they say, I think even under Biden, the move from the United States away from a really robust strategic posture in Asia towards a trajectory in which it essentially moves out of the region, I think that was already well underway. So I think Trump is very significant, but in a sense, his moves are really in some ways reflecting the longer term trends that were present under Biden, and for that matter, going all the way back to Obama and George W. Bush. I think the long pattern of America's response to China's astonishing rise over the last 25, 30 years has been to step back implicitly by failing to take the kinds of steps that would be necessary to preserve its strength in Asia in the face of China's growing power. Now, what that means for Australia, very simply, is that we have to move away from presuming that, if I can put it this way, America can solve our problems for us. I think the tendency in Australia, the assumption was that if China challenged US leadership in Asia, the United States would push back and would effectively contain China's challenge. And what we needed to do is, if we wanted to continue to live in an Asia which was dominated by the United States, which we did, all we needed to do was to support the United States, and the United States would make it all work for us. Now, I think what Australia needs to do is to get over that illusion. We have to recognise that whether we like it or not, we are going to live in an Asia in which Asian powers like China, like India, for that matter, like Indonesia, are going to be the primary players in this part of the world. The United States is not going to play a very significant role. By supporting the United States in its talk about confronting and containing China, we won't succeed in seeing the United States remain the dominant power. We'll simply make it harder to manage the transition to that new Asia that we're heading into, whether we like it or not. I do think, observing China's rise has been one of the great constants of my career. I first started observing these things in about 1980, so really just at the time when Deng Xiaoping started the process which has produced modern China. And for a very long time now, I've thought that the rise of China was the most significant strategic event in my lifetime, and I think that's proved to be the case, and that it would fundamentally transform Asia's strategic affairs and Australia's place in the region and Australia's strategic affairs. I think that's proved to be the case. It's always seemed to me to be that we in the West have continually underestimated China. We've continually been surprised by how much China has achieved, and I think there's still a bit of a tendency to underestimate China. And it's always seemed to me that China was, as its power grew, going to become more ambitious and more assertive about its role regionally and globally, not because of anything specific about China, but just because that's the way great powers always tend to behave. That's what Britain did when Britain rose to be a great power. That's what America did when America rose to be a great power. For that matter, it's what Japan did when Japan rose to be a great power. But it's also always seemed to me that how that would happen, what kind of a great power China would become, what kind of a leader in the region it would be, and what that would mean for Australia. That depended a great deal on developments in China, but also depended a great deal on how the rest of us reacted. And it's always seemed to me that one of the challenges for all of us, both countries like America from outside the region, but also those of us inside the region, is to think very carefully about what kind of role we want to play in helping to shape the kind of regional great power that China becomes. And I think that's still the great challenge we face.